So yeah, this evening is on lectures 2, 3, and 4. So way back, quite a few weeks ago now, I guess. Well, only 2 weeks ago. Feels like January's been a lot longer than it is. But anyway, next week, where there's the midterm coming up, probably all 3 of my sessions will be different next week. So probably like Sunday will be last week's content, and then Monday and Wednesday review. That's probably what I will do. Subject to change, but probably what I'll do is, yeah, Sunday. Maybe Sunday I'll do last week's content. Monday I'll do this week's content. Wednesday review. I think that's what I'll do. Either way, I will probably make a post about it on the news section of the PAL D2L, because it should be up by then. If it's not, I'll make a post on the news section of the actual class bio D2L. Okay, I've done a lot of talking. So let's get into things. Okay, so yeah, if there are any questions at any point, feel free to let me know. I can't see when you have your hands raised, but feel free to just like turn on your mic and, you know, cut me off. Like, I won't be offended. Or I do get notifications when you send a message to the chat, so I can check that. Sometimes I miss it. So if you sent something to the chat and I've missed it, turn your mic on and let me know. I'm not trying to ignore you. Okay, so the 4 main steps which led to the origins of life. This lecture, I thought there was something else important that I didn't include just because I can only fit so much into a PAL session. Oh goodness, what's the word? The qualities of life, essentially. I think that was like the word. I think there's 8 qualities, things like reproduction, that sort of thing, that all living things, you know, share. I think that's important too. So don't like neglect that. But I think that those are all pretty straightforward, whereas this is a little bit more complicated. So I chose to go over this instead. Hope that's okay. The other stuff was like, I don't know, pretty straightforward. We all know what reproduction is at this point. So yeah, but I still think it's important. Okay, anyway, I need to focus. So of the 4 main steps which led to the origins of life, the first one was abiotic synthesis of small organic molecules, such as amino acids. Yeah, that's probably the one that really gets me, that I think is like really cool. I know when I took this course, I've talked about this in my other sessions this week, and I made myself sound like I don't believe in science. That's not the case. But when I took this course, I was like, no way, like that, I don't know, it just seems crazy. I'm like, abiotic synthesis, weren't we taught to believe that's like not real? But anyway, so what's important to note with that is you definitely don't need to understand kind of like how this abiotic synthesis occurred and we ended up with amino acids. That's probably, you know, requires a PhD or something, a bit beyond the scope of this course, but just kind of know the steps. And anyway, so back to me being a non-believer, but like not really. I was just like, whoa, that's kind of crazy. And it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. So we talked briefly in the pre-recorded lectures about Miller and Urey, who were researchers who kind of explored the origins of life, and they replicated the conditions of early Earth in a closed system. And they were able to, you know, replicate this abiotic synthesis and ended up with amino acids and proteins, that sort of thing. So it sounds crazy, but it's been replicated. So it's, you know, reputable. It's possible. It's true, even if it sounds like it's something right out of a sci-fi book. Anyway, so yeah, I just found that kind of mind-boggling, I guess. But anyway. So the second step after formation of these small organic molecules, such as amino acids, was the formation of, macromolecules. Monomers. So monomers such as amino acids. We know that amino acids are monomers of proteins. So things like proteins and nucleic acids. Oh my. There we go. Yeah, that's essentially all I want to say about that. It's kind of intuitive, I guess, that amino acids were produced, and then those amino acids went on to produce proteins, or to form proteins, I guess, because we know that's what amino acids do, protein synthesis. I mean, they have other functions as well, but that's how proteins are made. So the third step was the formation of things known as protocells. So these protocells, they're not quite a real cell like how we would define a cell today, but they can be defined as a lipid-bound droplet. So, you know, kind of similar to a cell. It's got like a barrier around it. And it has, this is key, internal chemistry different from the environment. I think I figured out my typing thing. I always make typos at my PAL sessions. I think it's because I sit in a really casual, weird position. And that's why I make so many more typos. Also, my laptop sounds like a jet engine taking off because it's been plugged in for a few hours. So if you can hear that background noise, my apologies. Okay, but the protocells. So what's key about the internal chemistry being different from the environment is that that is something that cells today also exhibit. We talked, you know, in the previous course about lots of different mechanisms that take place in the cell that require the internal chemistry being different from the environment. So some examples are pH gradients, proton gradients like in ATP synthesis, that sort of thing. So having an internal chemistry being different from the environment was kind of a big advancement. The fourth step we talked about was the origin of self-replicating molecules and systems. So replication is essential to life. I guess you can have living things that don't replicate, but they're not going to last very long, right? Because there's no way to leave progeny. There's no way to kind of continue life through generations. So the ability to replicate was kind of that fourth thing that led to the continuance of life, I guess. It also leads to things like inheritance and selection, which are kind of key themes in the lectures that we've talked about. Well, I guess kind of this first week of lectures, this group of them. Okay, so those are the 4 main steps. Let me know if you have any questions about any of that. And if not, that's okay. Okay, I contemplated having this question here at all because I feel like everyone, not everyone, I guess, but most people have some general idea of what a fossil is. You know, some people even at a young age. I think we all knew someone in elementary school who was like obsessed with dinosaurs and fossils. Maybe that's not a universal experience, but I feel like it is. Every kid likes dinosaurs. But so yeah, I feel like fossil is a term that, you know, generally people recognize it. But to actually like talk about its significance in evolutionary terms is kind of another thing. So what a fossil is, to get just like a solid definition down, is a preserved remnant or impression left by an organism that lived in the past. So yeah, I mean, they can take a lot of different forms. You can get fossils of, you know, wide array of different organisms. I was talking in one of my sessions earlier this week about how, it's not, fossils are rare. I'm not saying that they're not, but you've heard stories of people going to the beach and finding a fossil. Particularly, there are certain beaches that are more, you're more apt to find a fossil. So it's not like you have to go on an archaeological dig to find fossils, but they are pretty rare for a variety of reasons. I mean, mostly, well, there's no mostly, there's just like a lot of factors, I guess. So they have to, the organism has to have some sort of hard part to actually leave an impression. So you're never going to get a fossil of like a slug, for example, because there's nothing hard to leave that impression. They have to kind of die in the right place at the right time. They have to be in a place that they're eventually going to be found. So I'm sure there are a lot more fossils than we know about because a lot of them are probably impossible to get to. Anyway, so why are they significant? They can provide insight on life and evolution. I guess that's kind of really summarizing it, simplifying it down. But basically, they can tell, okay, this sounds like a big cliche, but they can tell a story about the past. But like, that's true. They provide a lot of information about what life was like in the past that we otherwise would have absolutely no idea about. Yeah, it's kind of wild. And some fossils that have been found, I went to this is me getting off topic a little bit, still on topic, but I went to this presentation last winter before COVID. It was like a Darwin Day presentation. Someone, I think from the Royal Ontario Museum, was presenting at UNB about, fossils and evolution. And some of the fossils that they showed us and like the modeling that had been done to replicate, what did this organism look like when it lived 1 million years ago? They were the wackiest, wildest critters. I mean, most of them from the ocean, so you can imagine. It's just super fascinating. I never really thought I was that interested in fossils and like evolution. Thought I was more geared towards other forms of biology. I don't even know why I went to that presentation because I was thinking I wasn't going to like it that much, but then it really changed my mind on fossils. I found them super interesting after that presentation. So anyway, back to the present. They can just, give us indicators of what life was like in the past that we otherwise would have no access to. And it kind of allows us to kind of build on things and figure out, okay, how did the organisms that we have today, how did they become what they are today? Yeah. Okay. And then another pretty, okay, I say this isn't a straightforward question. What is evolution? It's a very loaded question. And there's no one true definition. You could define evolution a lot of different ways. I liked the definition that was in the slides, which was evolution is the process of change that has transformed life on Earth. Earliest beginnings to the diversity of, there we go, organisms living today. So I guess that kind of relates back to what I was just talking about. How, we can kind of look at a fossil record and take an animal that exists today and kind of piece together where it might have came from. It's kind of its lineages based on, I mean, there's advanced genetic work involved as well. It's not entirely fossil work. But yeah, it's not my favorite field in biology, but I think it's kind of interesting. So yeah, evolution could be defined a lot of different ways, but this is a good one. So the process of change that took us from early beginnings to the diversity of organisms that we see on the planet today. Okay, and we'll get back to that because we had a whole lecture on evolution and natural selection, so we will talk lots about it this evening. Okay, so next thing, what are key innovations and what are some examples? Specifically, I'm referring to key innovations on the tree of life. I'll add that in. So basically the tree of life, exactly what it sounds like, not a real tree though, I guess, but basically, a diagram of living things and things that lived in the past that no longer live today, and basically how everything connects with each other. It's very, to simplify it. And so key innovations are basically major events that kind of separate periods of life's history. Major evolutionary events that separate periods of life's history. So examples would include, one of the examples we talked about is the origin of new designs. So that could be things like feathers, organelles, like the mitochondria. So the mitochondria, hasn't always existed. At some point, it was, we'll actually get into that. Actually, I think we talked about that already, but just not in tonight's section that we're covering. Yeah, so it was a novel thing at one point. And so kind of you can think of key innovations as being things that separate periods of life's history. And they also, I guess, sometimes you can look at these key innovations and kind of sort things into before versus after. Another example would be evolutionary trends, like, an extinction, for example. Think of the extinction of the dinosaurs. It's not the biggest mass extinction in life's history, but it's kind of, what everyone thinks of when they think of an extinction. Maybe not everyone, a real geologist, might think differently. But frequently we, kind of do assign things to like, oh, this was before the dinosaurs. Oh, this only happened after the dinosaurs. So that's just kind of an example of how those key innovations can kind of split periods of time up. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but probably not talking any more than normal. I guess I feel like I'm going fast more than anything. So let me know if I am going too fast, if you need me to slow down or speed up or any of the above, I guess. Okay, so in the early 1800s, what was the proposed mechanism behind evolution? The early 1800s, that was a long time ago, obviously. I don't know why I felt the need to say that, but, a lot of things that we know now were not known then. And kind of the intellectual climate was drastically different, obviously. There were a lot of kind of names we threw around talking about like how they, in the long run, kind of contributed to evolution as we know it now. I wouldn't probably worry too much about all of those different names. Darwin, obviously you should know Darwin. And then one other name I think is pretty important is Lamarck and his kind of proposed mechanism behind evolution, because Darwin is largely regarded by the general public as being associated with evolution. Darwin, survival of the fittest, that sort of thing. But the actual, who's considered to be the father of evolution is Lamarck. And so in the early 1800s, it was Lamarck's proposal that was the generally believed mechanism behind evolution. And so that mechanism was the drive to become more complex. I'll throw his name in there. So, I mean, that makes sense. I definitely see where he was coming from because, you know, thinking, why do organisms evolve? To become more complex seems like a good answer. But we know now that's not entirely accurate. Sometimes organisms do evolve to become more complex. Sometimes they evolve to become less complex. And essentially, we know now it's more about, you know, trying to survive and pass on their genes to the next generation. So, you know, he had a half right, I guess, because in some organisms, if you become more complex, that increases your chances of survival. But anyway, he didn't have it completely right. And his mechanism kind of had two parts. One was better than the other. So the first part of his mechanism was use and disuse. And essentially what he thought there was that body parts that are frequently used, oh my goodness, will grow stronger, while those that are not used will deteriorate. There we go. There we go. So yeah, use and disuse. He made a point here, and it's not necessarily wrong. If you think of, you know, someone going to the gym, they only work one part of their body. Let's say they work legs. Every day is leg day. Then the muscles in their legs are going to grow stronger because they're being used more frequently. And maybe, you know, eventually they might start to lose muscle mass in their arms if they stop working muscles in their arms because they're only focusing on their legs. So to an extent, you know, this use and disuse theory isn't bad. But the second part of his mechanism was this inheritance of acquired traits. And so this was like a two-parter. You know, you can't have one without the other. He said that there's use and disuse. And through use and disuse, you acquire, you know, stronger body parts and weaker body parts. And then those acquired traits are inherited. And that's the part he got wrong. So basically, he said that modifications acquired during one's lifetime will be passed to offspring. And again, I can see where he's coming from because we know now that there are, you know, genetic traits get inherited. There are similarities between parent and offspring, but they're not the acquired traits. So if we go with our gym example, you know, that person was going to the gym, bulking up their legs, their arms were getting scrawny. And then if they decide to have a baby, the baby's not going to come out with jacked up calves, right? Because that's an acquired trait. It doesn't work like that. Another example is, you know, if a parent loses a limb somehow, some sort of accident, so they lost an arm, and then they have a baby, and like the baby's not going to come out missing an arm because their parent lost an arm, because that's an acquired trait. So yeah, this was generally believed and accepted though in the early 1800s. Although, you know, we see now it was flawed, but at the time it was generally what was kind of accepted as the mechanism behind evolution. And again, that was Lamarck. So Darwin came around, I think he was born in like 1809. Don't quote me on that for sure, but he was, you know, pretty early in the 1800s when he, you know, began working in this field. And he defined evolution differently. He proposed a new mechanism. And his mechanism is what we, accept today. Yeah, I'm just going to repeat myself. It's what we, accept today in the scientific community. So basically how he defined evolution, this is really loose, obviously, is as descent with modification. So by descent, that means, descending through generations. So parent to offspring, that offspring has offspring, and so on. And so with each descent, or not necessarily with each, because we know, evolution doesn't happen over one generation. As we kind of descend down that ladder of time, there are modifications that occur. So that's kind of, how he defined evolution. The term descent with modification is Darwin's work. And what was really important about his work was the mechanism. So the mechanism that he proposed was natural selection. And for a very long time, this was not accepted. He didn't want to publish his work because he knew like it would be kind of shoved aside, I guess. He knew that it wasn't going to be accepted. So I think, I could be wrong on this again, I'm trying to remember, but I'm pretty sure he was, dead and gone before it became largely accepted. He ended up publishing it later in his life, but I think by the time it was, the #1 most accepted mechanism of evolution, I'm pretty sure he was no longer alive. So I think he lived to see it, kind of start up, but he never lived to see it really become what it is now, obviously, because that was 200 years ago. Anyway, that's not important. But so the mechanism that he proposed was natural selection. And there were two main observations that led for him to propose this mechanism. So the first observation was that members of a population, whoopsies, they vary in heritable traits. So this is where we go from acquired traits to heritable traits, traits that are inherited, that an offspring acquires from its parent. And so he noted that within a population of organisms, there are variances in these traits. So, for example, in a population of humans, there's variances in hair color, eye color, that sort of thing, because they are traits that can be inherited. So he noticed that. The second thing that he noticed is that organisms produce more offspring than the environment can support. A little bit morbid. And because of this, many fail to survive and reproduce. So obviously, humans aren't the best example here because we have technology that allows us to, continue reproducing. The planet's way overpopulated, but we're like, that's the next generation's problem, generally. Which is a bit awful, but so yeah, humans aren't a great example here. But if you take a population of a wild animal of some sort, let's go with deer, lots of deer in New Brunswick. Eventually, if you have a population and they're all producing offspring, you're going to get this huge population of deer, and say they're living in a forest altogether. Eventually, there's going to be so many deer that there is not enough food for all of the deer in their forest. So they produce more offspring than the environment can support. And because of this, a lot of them are going to die. Maybe not a lot of them, but, not all of them are going to make it. So many fail to survive and reproduce. Yeah. Sorry, I've kind of lost my train of thought at the moment. Anyway, okay, so yeah, Some of them aren't going to make it. They're not going to survive. They're not going to reproduce, which is key because they're not getting their genes into the next generation's gene pool, which is a big bad thing in terms of evolution. So basically how these two observations kind of linked together is that he noticed that the ones that do survive and they do reproduce perhaps have varied in their heritable traits as compared to other members of that population. So actually the example I've been using for this, it's not the best. I just made it up, the other night, but I think it gets the point across, is say you have a population of Arctic wolves, or foxes, whatever you prefer, and some of them, they vary in their heritable traits in that some of them have inherited this lush, thick fur coat, whereas others have, a thinner fur coat. So in the winter, things get chilly, food is scarce, the wolf population, they lose some of their body fat that they might have put on in the summer. And so the ones that have that thick fur coat, they're going to be a bit more apt to survive. Whereas the ones with the thin fur coat, they might freeze to death. So they would be the ones that fail to survive and reproduce, obviously. And so the ones that were genetically predisposed to have this thick furry coat are going to be the ones that survive and reproduce, and they're going to pass the genes for that thick fur on to the next generation. So that's kind of how the two observations relate to each other, just in one example. Okay. I think that's all I had to say about that question. Pretty sure. Typically, if I'm doing the same a few times over the duration of a week, usually by Wednesday, I've thought of a lot of other things that I don't have written down on my sheet that I make, the Friday beforehand. So I'm always trying to think, did I come up with anything else when I was talking about this the other night that I should add in? But I think I'm good. Okay. So next thing, what is the main source of genetic variation, and how does this make evolution possible? I also wanted to reword this question. It's a little vague. How does genetic variation make evolution possible? Is what it probably should say if I were being more straightforward. So there's a few different sources of genetic variation, but the biggest, maybe not the biggest, the main source is through mutations. So mutations are just naturally prone to happen. If you took the previous course, which I think is a prereq for this course, we talked about mitosis, cell division, and how mutations can happen there. And I mean, you have so many cells within any given, well, not any given organism, I guess, but most animals, if you think of an animal you'd see in your backyard, or humans, for example, they have a lot of cells. Let's not worry about unicellular organisms because that's beside the point. So yeah, mutations, your cells are dividing, maybe not all the time, but they go through multiple rounds of division. You have tons of cells, so mutations are bound to occur even with whatever mechanisms that cell has to kind of stop mutations. Some are still going to happen, and that's okay. Mutations generally have this negative connotation, oh, it's a bad thing. Not always. Sometimes they're a good thing, sometimes they're a neutral thing, sometimes they are a bad thing. But anyway, so they can provide genetic variation because the genes have mutated, they're different, so that's going to cause variance in the genetic pool. another kind of main source of genetic variation, but it's not the #1 source, would be sexual reproduction. So we talked about sexual reproduction in the previous course as well, kind of how we have gametes from both parents and they mix together to create like a new combination, which is really good for genetic variation also. But not every organism reproduces sexually. Some organisms reproduce asexually, so they don't have that source of genetic variation. But even organisms that reproduce asexually will experience mutations. So mutations are kind of universal in that way. Okay, and so how does this genetic variation caused by mutations make evolution possible? In simple terms, evolution acts on differences. So differences are, are a result of genetic variation. So if, we're talking natural selection, which is the mechanism of evolution, and we just go back to that Arctic wolf example, if we had, they were all the same in their fur coat, then there's not really anything for evolution to act on, and there's not going to be a big difference in the next generation. Whereas where we have the differences, natural selection is going to favor those with the big, thick fur coats. And so because there's that difference, natural selection can act on that population. Okay, I hope that's clear. I hope I didn't butcher that. I think it came out a little bit more confusing than I intended for it to. But yeah, let me know if it didn't make sense or if you have any questions or concerns. I'm definitely going a bit quicker tonight, I think. I'm covering all the same material, but it seems as though we've taken less time. Okay, so what is the Hardy-Weinberg principle? Hardy-Weinberg, for this class, I would just want to kind of be aware of what it is, and I wouldn't, worry about how to use it, how to do the calculations behind it, any of that thing, or any of that stuff. If you take any genetics classes past this, then you will definitely be using it, doing calculations with the Hardy-Weinberg principle, but that is a concern for another time. I shouldn't say concern, it's not like there are these terrible calculations, but anyway, don't worry about it. I get so ahead of myself. So essentially, the Hardy-Weinberg principle is a mechanism to determine if a population is evolving over time. There we go. So yeah, you can use it, do some calculations, get a number, compare it to things, figure out, is this population evolving? And essentially, there are 5 conditions that need to be met in order for the population to be non-evolving. And those conditions usually don't get met in nature because in nature, populations do change over time. Maybe I should type some of this out. Oh, I don't know why I said largely ignored. That's not what I meant to say. They're rarely met in nature. I don't know where those words came from in my brain. I don't even think that's written down anywhere else, so I just kind of glitched, I guess. Anyway, so they're rarely met in nature because, as I said earlier, I wish more competent. There we go. Because populations do change over time. Yeah. So anyway, here are the conditions. We'll talk about why each of them, usually isn't met in nature. So the first one, well, I say the first one, but I don't think they're really in any particular order, but no mutations. So we talked briefly, earlier about mutations. There's nothing you can do to prevent them in nature. I mean, I'm not even, you could argue this and say, oh, you could prevent mutations by putting on sunscreen and, blocking UV rays so they can't give you mutations, whatever. You can make arguments like that. But in nature, in a not controlled environment, you can't do that. Yeah, so I mean, there are arguments you can make for each of these points, but no mutations are going to happen. They just do. Next one is random mating. So this one you could definitely argue, oh, that might happen in nature, fairly random. But you also have to kind of consider things like competition in mating. So a lot of species are very competitive about mating. Think of, like a peacock, for example, the male with the extravagant tail feathers. Generally, that male would have the opportunity to mate with as many, probably, of the female peacocks in that population as he wants to, because he's the big guy, king peacock with the most glamorous tail feathers. Whereas another peacock with less glamorous tail feathers may not get the chance to mate at all. And so that's going to pass those extravagant tail feather genes into the next generation. So yeah, you could definitely argue that mating is random to an extent, but it might be less random than you think when you actually get thinking about it. Another one is large population size. So again, this one, that could happen in nature. Why not, really? I mean, depends on what organism you're talking about, what environment they're in. This one's definitely, I would say, the one that could be most easily met in nature. But all 5 of these have to be met for the population to not evolve, all 5. So the chances that all 5 are going to happen at the same time is virtually non-existent. No, gene flow is the next one. So we haven't really talked about gene flow. Well, I guess we did in the lectures, but tonight we haven't talked about it yet. But essentially, it's new alleles moving into a new population. So again, this isn't super realistic that this could happen in nature, because think of, go back to that deer population we talked about. What are the odds that another deer from another population is never, ever going to walk into that part of their forest? Pretty unrealistic that would never happen in nature. And then the last one is no natural selection. Oh, actually, I should point out with the no gene flow thing, someone asked, what about an island? In one of my previous sessions. And I was like, yeah, that would be probably a good example of where there is no gene flow occurring, depending on the organism. If you had a bird on an island, they could still do gene flow. But yeah, other organisms, not so much. So that would be an example where the no gene flow condition is met. But again, you have to have all 5 for the population to not evolve. So yeah. No natural selection is the last one. Again, this could maybe be met if there were no variances in genotypes, phenotypes of the population, but that's probably pretty rare that you have a bunch of, essentially clones of each other all living together. Okay. Again, I feel like I'm going a little bit fast, but maybe not, because I think I had about 10 minutes left for this section every other night. So the 3 factors that lead to the most evolutionary change. Again, I don't think they're in any particular order, but I'll go in the order that we did in the pre-recorded videos. So starting with natural selection. leads to a lot of evolutionary change. And essentially, and we've kind of beaten this one to death a little bit tonight. We've talked about it a lot. But we haven't really defined it, I guess. And again, it's one of those things you could define it a million different ways. But you can define it as when certain genotypes are, there we go, are favored due to their corresponding phenotype being selected and by selected, I mean, giving some evolutionary advantage. So thinking back to our Arctic wolves, you would think I would stick with either the deer or the wolves, but they both keep coming back anyway. So obviously the ones with the thick furry coat, they were favored their genotype. No. Sorry, I got it twisted a little bit. What I have written is right, but I was about to say it wrong. So their phenotype is that they have that thick furry coat. I remember phenotype, physical characteristic. So yeah, their phenotype is that they have this big, thick furry coat. And so that's their corresponding genotype is favored because the genotype gets passed on. So their phenotype is selected because it gives some evolutionary advantage. And so they have a better chance of surviving, of reproducing, and then passing on their genotype, which is the genotype for the phenotype of thick fur. Again, I kind of feel like I made that a little bit more confusing than it had to be. Let me know if I did. Okay. The next one is genetic drift. I find it an interesting concept. I don't know why, but basically what genetic drift is changes in allele frequencies. That's not how you spell that. Due to chance. So just due to random chance, there are changes in the allele frequencies. So let's get a sub bullet going on. I'll use that guy. So, okay, I'm going to type this out and then I'll kind of give it a bit more context. If only half of the population, that's not how you spell population, there we go, reproduces for whatever reason, and all of those reproducing organisms happen to all have the same genotype, then the other genotypes will be lost. It's kind of wordy. So if we have a population, let's say it's a small group of 10 individuals, and for whatever reason, only half of them reproduce, only 5. And so let's say we had 5 homozygous dominant individuals and 3 heterozygous and 2 homozygous recessive. Just for example, don't write that down. And so the 5 that just happened to be the ones that reproduced all had the homozygous dominant genotype. Then the other genotypes that don't reproduce will be lost. Okay, but the difference is I could be describing here kind of, natural selection, but genetic drift is when it's random. So an example would be these 5 that didn't reproduce, they died in a fire. And it wasn't that they had, a particular trait that made them survive the fire, it was just random. So genetic drift reduces genetic variation, especially in small populations. And there are these 2 concepts called the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. So the bottleneck effect is when you have some type of event that's going to be, you know, like a bottleneck. Obviously, that wasn't very clear, but there's some type of event that drastically cuts down the population. So, you know, for example, forest fire, like I just said. So that would be an example of a bottleneck effect. Founder effect would be, you know, for example, if you have a population of migrating birds, they're migrating south, it's a foggy day, they're a big population, but then kind of a small cluster of them get separated from the rest of the pack, herd. I don't know the appropriate term to use for a group of birds. Flock, that's definitely it. So let's say a small group gets separated from the rest of the big flock, and the small group can't find their flock, so they fly off together and they start their own population. So let's say that those ones that got lost all happened by random chance to have the same genotypes. And so when they, you know, become founders of this new population, they've lost the diversity that the big group had. Okay. Hope that makes sense. That is essentially founder effect. Okay, and then the third one that leads to the most evolutionary change is gene flow, which we briefly talked about earlier. And essentially what it is the movement of alleles among populations due to, whoopsies, movement of fertile individuals. That's better. Or gametes. So gametes would be, you know, pollen. It's wind driven. So what's to stop the wind from blowing these grains of pollen from flowers in one field to the other population in another field? Or like I said, the fertile individuals could be another deer leaves one population, walks to a new forest, and it joins another population of deer. So gene flow can kind of act either way in terms of increasing or decreasing genetic variation, because if you have an organism bring new alleles to a population, that's going to increase the genetic variation in that population because you have these new alleles that you didn't have before. Whereas if you have the population that deer left behind is now missing those alleles. So that could potentially decrease the genetic variation in the original population. But either way, it leads to evolutionary change. And that's just essentially kind of what gene flow is. Just moving alleles from one population to the next. And the alleles, obviously, alleles aren't, you know, things that can get up and walk away. So they have to move through something like, you know, an animal or a gamete, you know, pollen, for example. Okay, so that's all I had prepared for this evening. But if there are any questions, please feel free to let me know. Let's get back, make sure I haven't, no, we're good, we're good. I'm always nervous that I'm gonna miss things in the chat. Okay, I'll stop the recording.